The flames twisted in the air like hungry tongues, casting an orange glow over the gathered faces of Hollow Creek. Men, women, and even children stood shoulder to shoulder on the dirt rise above the old cattle branding pit, their eyes fixed on the trembling figure below. The smell of smoke, sweat, and self-righteousness filled the dusk, thick enough to choke on. Bound at the wrists, her bare feet sinking into the trampled mud, Willa Ray stood before the fire with tears streaking the soot on her cheeks. Her lips moved in silent prayer, though no god seemed to be listening. She was 17, a laundress, a virgin, and tonight, a condemned soul. The preacher's voice boomed above the crackling pit, slick with fury and theatricality. This child of sin, this whispering serpent in a girl's skin, has tempted the good man of Hollow Creek with her impure silence, with her eyes, with her cursed stillness. His hand shot upward like a judge at the gallows. By fire she shall be cleansed, by water turned to steam, the evil shall flee. The crowd murmured, stirred like cattle at feeding time. Some nodded, others clutched hands. But a few, just a few, looked away, not in pity, in discomfort. As if deep down, something didn't sit right. Willa didn't scream. She had already done her screaming, alone in the sheriff's holding room the night before. She had begged when they first dragged her from the laundry shed where she worked. Cried when the sheriff refused to listen. Broken down when they tied her hands with coarse rope and threw her in a wagon like a side of beef. But now, in front of all of Hollow Creek, she stayed silent. Not out of courage, because her voice had simply run out. A rough cough came from beside the pit. Two boys, barely old enough to shave, hauled a bubbling iron cauldron on a sled of planks, its handle gripped in thick gloves. The pot sloshed with boiling water, the steam rising like a phantom reaching for the girl. One of the boys gagged and turned his face away from Willa. The other just stared, lips pressed into a thin line. A man near the front of the crowd shouted, "If she weren't guilty, she'd have defended herself." "Exactly," cried another. "The devil hides behind meekness." "Let her burn," came a third voice, female, sharp, bitter. Willa's gaze flicked toward the source. Mrs. Whitcomb, the mayor's wife. The woman whose husband had once grabbed Willa's wrist at the well, then accused her of seduction when Willa pulled away. The preacher stepped toward the cauldron and raised both arms. "As it is written, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." The flames surged higher. Do we fear fire? No, because truth cannot be burned. But lies, filth, temptation, these must be boiled from the flesh. Willa's knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, the rope at her wrists scraping her raw. A cry caught in her throat, but never made it past her lips. She stared into the flames, into the faces of people she'd once smiled at, nodded to, brought folded linens to on market days. No one moved to stop it. Then the preacher lowered his arms. "Begin." The crowd leaned forward. And the fire roared. Before the fire, before the ropes, before the preacher's voice turned judgment into theater, Willa Ray had lived a life so quiet, it almost slipped from memory. She was the kind of girl you passed on the road and remembered only for the way she lowered her eyes, not in shame, but in deference, in peace. She didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't linger in doorways, didn't attend Sunday socials or stay after church to sip lemonade and endure the stiff smiles of women who saw her as little more than an orphan with too much hair and too little sense of place. She came to Hollow Creek when she was no taller than a feed sack, her mama already in the ground from fever, her daddy never named. Old Mrs. Cora took her in for a while, mostly for the county stipend. But when Cora died, the girl was passed around like borrowed soap. No kin, no claim, no voice. So Willa learned how to survive by being useful and invisible. She scrubbed floors at the tavern, washed sheets that stank of sweat and whiskey, and things no girl should have to touch. She kept to herself in the linen closet, she called a room, no bigger than a stable stall, lit only by a candle stub and a cracked window that let in more noise than breeze. Yet she never complained. She swept the church steps every Saturday morning and tended to the coughing children of the mining wives when no one else had the time. She knew the smell of sickness, of hunger, of sorrow because they lived beside her like kin. She wasn't pretty in the way the preacher's daughter was, all powder and ringlets. But she was something else, something quiet and haunting. Her eyes were too knowing, her hands too graceful. She moved like a prayer half-whispered, and that frightened people, especially the wives, who saw their husbands' glances linger too long when she passed. Especially the men, who didn't understand a girl who didn't giggle or flirt or bat her lashes like a proper maiden. Willa Ray simply existed, and that made her dangerous. The rumors began with whispers in sewing circles, fueled by jealousy and boredom. That she had the devil's touch, that babies stopped crying when she walked into a room not because she was gentle, but because she was unnatural. That the reason she never spoke ill of anyone was because she was listening to spirits instead. It was nonsense, but it stuck. Then came the night the blacksmith was caught in her room. He'd been drinking, everyone knew that. He staggered up the stairs behind the tavern and forced open her door. Willa screamed, threw a lamp at him. The commotion brought others running. But by the time the sheriff arrived, the blacksmith was already outside, his shirt torn, blood on his lip, and his pride in shambles. She tempted me, he slurred. Opened the door for me. Devil Girl tried to put a spell on me. And just like that, the town believed him. Willa never got to speak. She wasn't asked. Her silence, the same silence she'd carried like armor her whole life, was now her noose. Within a day, the elders had convened. Within 2, the preacher was ranting about purifying sin with flame. And by the 3rd, she was tied at the wrists in front of a fire meant not for cattle, but for a girl who had never once asked for anything but mercy. The flames danced with a kind of wicked joy, licking at the iron rim of the old branding pit, now turned altar. Smoke curled upward in thick, greasy ribbons, carrying with it the scent of burning wood, old sin, and something else, something sacred being smothered. The townsfolk had grown quiet, the earlier jeers and mutters swallowed by anticipation, by fear, by something they wouldn't dare name. The only sounds now were the hiss of steam from the cauldron and the muffled creak of Willa Ray's bindings as she shifted on her knees in the dirt. She didn't scream. Not when the preacher started reciting his scripture with the fervor of a man performing for both heaven and a crowd. Not when the 2 boys who'd hauled the bubbling cauldron began inching it forward, their faces ghostly in the firelight. Not even when a hot fleck of ash landed on her shoulder and seared through the thin fabric of her dress. Her lips moved, just barely, a whisper with no sound. Perhaps it was a prayer, or perhaps it was just the final pieces of her mind coming undone. Sheriff Tully stood off to the side, boots planted in the dirt, hat low over his brow. His mustache twitched once, but he said nothing. Did nothing. He'd seen murder before. Theft. Broken men bleeding out on saloon floors. But this? This was a different kind of killing. The kind cloaked in law and scripture and fear. The kind that left no body hanging, but still made ghosts. His eyes met Willa's for a heartbeat. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. If she was afraid, it was buried beneath something deeper, something older. Tully shifted his weight, but not enough to matter. He wouldn't stop it, not today. The preacher's voice rose again. She who has led righteous men into wicked thought shall be made clean through flame and water. Let her sin rise with the steam and be cast into the pit from which it came. His arms lifted, long sleeves falling back to reveal pale wrists veined with rage. The crowd leaned forward. Mothers clutched their children. Men wiped their brows and clenched their jaws. No one moved to object. No one dared. It had gone too far now. To stop it would mean admitting they'd been wrong. That fear had won. That a girl could be innocent. The cauldron scraped against the stone lip of the pit, steam hissing up in clouds that shrouded Willa like a veil. One of the boys wavered. His hands trembled on the handle. The other nudged him. Just pour, he whispered, voice cracking. Willa closed her eyes. Not tight like someone preparing for pain, but soft, gentle like she was saying goodnight to the world. Her shoulders rose with one last breath. And then the preacher's hand dropped. Everything held its breath, even the fire. Then, a voice, like a gunshot through silence, shattered the ritual. But not yet, not yet. For that single, awful moment, the town stood suspended in smoke and silence, one heartbeat away from something they would never be able to take back. The silence that cloaked the square was thick enough to choke on. Even the flames seemed to hesitate, snapping lower, as if listening. The boys held the cauldron between them, arms locked, steam curling up and kissing their faces. The preacher's hand still hovered in the air, eyes locked on Willa as if she were already ash. The townsfolk leaned in, a collective breath held between righteousness and ruin. And then it came. That's my daughter. The voice wasn't a plea, it wasn't a protest. It was a roar, raw and jagged, slicing through the tension like a thunderclap, splitting the heavens. Every head turned at once. The preacher's arm froze midair. Even Sheriff Tully's eyes jolted up, startled from his own stillness. From the far edge of the crowd, where the dirt path gave way to dry brush and fence post shadows, a man pushed through the mass of bodies with all the force of a charging bull. Broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, his presence parted the onlookers like a blade through soft bread. His hat was tipped low, shadowing a face carved by wind and years, his gray beard catching sparks of firelight like iron filings to a forge. Silas Maddox. The name passed in whispers before he even reached the fire. A rancher, a war veteran, a man who hadn't spoken more than 10 words in town since his wife died 3 winters ago. He lived on the outskirts, worked alone, and only came to town when he had tushly for bullets or barley. No one knew him well. Everyone knew not to cross him. And not a soul had ever heard of him having a child. Until now. Silas's boots slammed into the packed earth, each step deliberate, thudding like a warning drum. His eyes dark, stormy, furious locked onto Willa. The girl on her knees, rope-bitten wrists trembling, tears crusted on soot-dark cheeks. She looked up at him, confused, wary, like she wasn't sure if the voice had come from her mind or the sky. The preacher sputtered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish flung onto shore. This is no concern of yours, Maddox, he said, though his voice lacked its usual fire. This is Church Lalder's judgment. Silas didn't stop walking. I said that's my daughter, he growled again, louder, clearer. The words rang out across the crowd and echoed off the chapel wall like a shot fired into judgment itself. He reached the platform and mounted the steps without invitation, stepping between Willa and the cauldron. The 2 boys stepped back, terrified. Sheriff Tully finally stirred. Silas, you got proof of what you're saying? He asked, though even he sounded unsure. Silas reached into his worn coat and pulled out a folded yellowed letter. His hand trembled only slightly as he passed it forward. My name's in there, he said. So is hers. Her mother wrote it before she died. Sent it with the girl. Been carrying it ever since. Tully opened it. Read. His brow furrowed. Silas wasn't done. He reached into the front of his shirt and pulled out a small silver locket, the clasp half rusted, hanging on a cord. He held it up for all to see. She's got one just like it, he said. Her mother gave them to us both the same night she told me I was going to be a father. All eyes turned to Willa. Slowly, trembling, she reached under the collar of her dress and pulled her own locket into view. The twin of the one in Silas's palm. The crowd murmured. The preacher paled. Willa looked from the locket to the man, then back again, her eyes wide, lips trembling. A single whisper left her lips. Papa? And Silas, grizzled, bitter, broken, fell to one knee beside her, pulled her into his arms, and held her like a man trying to fix years of absence in one breath. His voice cracked for the first time that night as he whispered back, I got you now, baby girl. They ain't taken you from me. And for the first time since the fire was lit, Willa Ray sobbed not in fear, but in something close to hope. Silas didn't flinch, as 1,000 stares pressed in on him like heat from the fire. He rose slowly, his arms still around Willa, as if daring anyone to try and take her again. The flickering flames cast deep hollows under his eyes, lines carved from years of silence and labor cutting across his weathered face like dry riverbeds. He turned, slow and deliberate, until he faced the elders seated in their makeshift judgment circle, their backs rigid with self-importance, their hands folded like gods on borrowed thrones. "She's mine," Silas said, his voice low but sharp as a whetted blade. "Born of my blood, whether you like it or not." The preacher's mouth opened, his righteous fury now stumbling over its own feet. You come in here with no warning, with no witnesses, and you expect us to stop the righteous course of justice because of some wild claim?" Silas didn't blink. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a weathered envelope, its edges softened by time, corners creased and frayed like it had been read 100 times and folded 100 more. He stepped forward, slowly, and held it out for Sheriff Tully to take. The lawman hesitated, then stepped between them, the fire crackling behind his shoulder like it wanted a say in the matter. "She wrote it the night before she died," Silas said. "The girl's mother. Her name was Lillian Greer. She was passing through town 17 years back, head full of stories and a wagon with a busted axle. She stayed at my place 3 nights while we waited for parts from Yuma. We didn't speak much, but—" His voice faded, and he looked toward Willa again, something like shame crawling up his throat. "She left that letter with the innkeeper before she moved on. Said if anything ever happened to her to send the girl to Hollow Creek." Tully unfolded the letter, eyes scanning quickly across the slanted ink. His jaw clenched. He read slower the second time. "She names you, all right," he muttered. "And the locket?" Silas added. He took a step back, unbuttoning the worn oilskin coat he'd worn for years through dust storms and cattle births and lonely winters. He opened it to reveal a length of cord looped through the buttonhole of his shirt. Hanging from it was a small oval locket, dull silver with a faded engraving, 2 clasped hands under a crescent moon. He lifted it up with 2 fingers, letting it dangle in the firelight. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Willa reached into her collar and pulled free the identical locket. For a moment, neither of them breathed. "She gave us both one," Silas said, louder now, so even the back of the crowd could hear. "Said if the day ever came when we needed to find each other, we'd know." The preacher's jaw worked like he was chewing on gravel. This don't change her sins." "You mean the sins you piled on her without proof?" Silas snapped. "You judged a girl for being quiet, for being kind, for refusing to bat her lashes at men who couldn't control themselves." He stepped forward again, dropping his rifle at the preacher's feet with a heavy thud. "You don't need to burn her. You already tried to burn her soul. That ends now." Tully stepped between them, his hand resting on the butt of his gun but not drawing it. His voice, for once, carried weight. "The girl's got a name, she's got a father, and I'm thinking that changes a hell of a lot." For the first time, the fire wasn't the brightest thing in the square. It was the fury in Silas Maddox's eyes. The preacher looked away. The townsfolk did too. Because there are some truths too heavy to stare at head-on, and a father claiming his daughter in front of a town that tried to kill her was one of them. The preacher's lip curled back, revealing teeth stained yellow from years of sermon shouting and pride-swallowed bitterness. The fire hissed behind him, and for a moment, the shadows on his face made him look like the very devil he preached against. He pointed a crooked finger toward Silas and Willa, voice rising into something almost feral. "Don't be fooled," he spat. "The devil is clever. He sends his temptresses in plain dresses, cloaked in tears and innocence. This rancher's been bewitched. Can't you see it? She's not his blood, she's his curse." Gasps tore through the crowd. Some women clutched their shawls tighter, stepping back from Willa as if sin could be caught like a cough. A man near the front muttered something about sorcery. Another, emboldened by the preacher's frenzy, shouted, "She's still a witch," marked the smith, made his tongue lie. "She didn't make that man do anything," someone else answered from the crowd, though the voice was swallowed by the mounting clamor. Tensions snapped taut like stretched rope. The crowd was splitting down the middle, some drawn to the preacher's fury, others shaken by the proof Silas had brought, but too afraid to speak louder than a whisper. Uncertainty was a dangerous thing in Hollow Creek, and fear always made people cruel. "She's got the locket," Sheriff Tully said, lifting the letter again as if it might shield him from what was unraveling. "The paper matches. Her name's in it, his too. Hell, even the dates line up." "You think Satan can't forge a signature?" the preacher snapped, spinning toward the sheriff with his eyes blazing. "You think evil doesn't keep dates? That's what it wants, to lull you into logic. She's lying. Her mother was a gypsy witch, her blood is cursed, and now she's got her claws in him." Silas took one step forward, the firelight glinting off the barrel of the revolver now raised in his weathered hand. "That's enough," he said, steady, calm, and deadly. "No more words." The preacher's mouth flapped, but no sound came out. Every eye turned toward the gun. The crowd grew deathly quiet again, like the wind had been sucked from the earth. Some men stepped back. Others held their ground, hands twitching near their belts, but none of them moved forward. Silas shifted, placing himself squarely in front of Willa, his boots planted firm in the dust. His thumb brushed over the hammer of the revolver, but he didn't pull it back, not yet. "Any man who takes one more step toward this girl," he growled, "best be prepared to bury his pride 6 feet under with his body. I've buried men for cattle. Don't think I won't do it for her." The preacher looked to Sheriff Tully, eyes wide, waiting for him to act, for the law to take his side, for someone in authority to save him from being publicly challenged. Tully's hand hovered near his holster, fingers drumming against the wood. He looked between Silas and the preacher, sweat dotting his brow despite the cool night breeze. His mouth opened, then closed again. He didn't move. That was answer enough. The preacher turned on the sheriff with venom in his gaze. "You're going to stand there and let this happen? Let this man threaten justice?" Tully exhaled, heavy and low. "You call this justice? Burning a girl without a fair hearing? Without evidence? I ain't sure what this is anymore, but I know I'm not drawing on a man for protecting his own blood." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some folks hung their heads, others scowled, but no one moved to challenge Silas again. Willa, still kneeling, her locket resting against her chest, dared to breathe. Just once. Just enough. Because something had cracked in the town square that night, something brittle and dangerous. And though the fire still burned, it was no longer the hottest thing in Hollow Creek. It was the rage in Silas Maddox's eyes, and the resolve in his voice when he said, "My daughter isn't dying today." The fire still hissed behind them, but it was no longer the center of attention. Silas stood tall, revolver now holstered but his hand still close, his arm curled protectively around Willa's trembling shoulders. The preacher glared, jaw clenched, but said nothing. Sheriff Tully hovered between them like a man caught in a flood unsure whether to swim with it or be dragged under. Silas raised his voice, loud enough for the entire town square to hear. "If this town still calls itself civilized, then we don't boil women without hearing the whole damn truth first. You want justice? Then let's have a trial, right now, right here, in front of everyone." A beat of stunned silence followed. Then the preacher scoffed. "We already had a judgment." "You had a lynch mob," Silas snapped. "Now you'll hear the truth, or I swear by everything holy, I'll take my daughter and burn every lie in this square to the ground." Sheriff Tully nodded slowly. "A public hearing," he said. "No flames, no punishment, not unless it's earned." He turned to the preacher, who looked like he'd swallowed a snake. "You got nothing to hide. You won't mind people speaking their piece." The preacher backed down, lips thin with fury. "Fine. but let the girl stand and face the town if she's so innocent. They made Willa stand near the church steps, backlit by torchlight, as if they meant to frame her in holy fire. Her hands still trembled, her lips were dry. She looked smaller now, surrounded by the very people who had cheered for her death minutes earlier. But she stood. Her locket glinted faintly in the dark, a single token of safety in a crowd thick with judgment. The first witness was Mrs. Whitcomb. "She's sly," the woman hissed. "Walks quiet, keeps her eyes low like a fox in the henhouse. Always around when men are working. My husband said she smiled at him once. Inappropriately." A few women in the crowd nodded. Another muttered, "She's too quiet to be honest. Mize, to be." Then came the baker's wife. "She nursed my daughter back to health when she had the fever," she admitted. "But I did always find her strange. She never came to socials. That's not natural." Whispers stirred. Willa didn't speak, didn't defend, just stood there, her chin high and eyes shining. She had nothing to say to people who already knew the truth and chose to ignore it. Then the blacksmith was called. He stumbled forward, sweat beading at his temples. She tempted me," he said, voice wavering. "Called me up to her room. Too lost control, but she let me in." His voice didn't carry like it had before. There was a shakiness in it now, a hollowness. That's when the stable boy stepped out. He couldn't have been older than 13. Freckles across his cheeks, hands shoved deep in his trouser pockets. He looked at the sheriff, then at Silas, then square at Willa. "That's not what happened," he said. "I saw it. That night, I was sleeping in the loft, over the stalls, heard shouting. Looked down and saw the blacksmith jimmy in her door open with a hook. He wasn't invited," she screamed, threw something at him. He ran out with blood on his lip. A hush fell so deep, even the wind seemed to stop. The preacher stammered, "Boy, do you know what you're saying?" "Yes, sir," the boy answered, "steady now. I saw it with my own eyes." The blacksmith tried to step forward, mouth open in protest, but the silence of the crowd stopped him cold. Their eyes were on him now, not Willa. Their ears listening for a lie, not looking for an excuse. Willa looked at the boy, her eyes wide. He nodded at her once, awkwardly, then stepped back into the crowd like he'd just done something normal. But everything had changed, because someone finally told the truth, and for the first time, the town had no choice but to listen. The blacksmith stood stiff and trembling, his face pale under the heat of every eye in Hollow Creek. He had never looked smaller. His broad chest, once the pride of the forge, now rose and fell like a man about to drown. The stable boy's voice still echoed in the square, louder in memory than it had been in sound. Silence stretched thin, ready to snap. "You gonna answer that, Orton?" Sheriff Tully asked, voice low, dangerous. Orton's lips parted, then closed again. Sweat dripped from his brow. He looked at Willa, who stood straight now, her back rigid with quiet fire. He looked at the preacher, who refused to meet his gaze, already retreating behind a veil of furious disbelief. And finally, he looked at the crowd, the same crowd that had once lifted mugs with him at the saloon, the same faces that had turned on a girl because he'd said a few easy lies. "I didn't think it'd get this far," Orton muttered. "Just wanted to protect myself." Tully stepped forward. "You better speak plain, Orton." The blacksmith wiped his mouth with the back of his shaking hand. "I lied," he said. His voice cracked. "I went to her room. I'd been drinking. Thought she'd be easy. She wasn't. She fought, screamed, hit me in the mouth with a lamp, I think. I ran out bleeding, and when folks started asking questions, I said she'd tempted me." Gasps broke from the crowd like cracks in a frozen pond. "I thought folks'd believe it," Orton said, blinking like a man lost in his own nightmare. "She's always quiet, doesn't talk much, easy to paint her as strange, witchy, and what harm could it do?" Willa didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just stared at him like someone watching a story she already knew the ending to. Silas took one slow step forward. Then another. His boots crunched the dirt like thunder in a dry canyon. "You didn't just lie," he said, voice low but rising with fury. "You put a noose around her neck. You poured oil on the fire. You watched them drag her out here and say she was cursed. And you said nothing." Orton bowed his head. "I didn't mean." "You meant to save yourself," Silas interrupted, louder now. "And every person who shouted for that fire, every so-called righteous hand that pointed at this girl, they were ready to murder her because it was easier than questioning the lies of a drunk man with a hammer and a full beard." The murmurs grew. Shame was a heavy thing, and it was sinking into the bones of the crowd. Silas turned to face them all. "How many other girls have we thrown to the fire? How many were called temptress, witch, or worse because they were quiet, or poor, or different? And how many men, walked away clean after throwing dirt on them?" He pointed at the preacher. "This man," he said, "was ready to boil a girl alive in God's name with no proof but gossip. He's no shepherd, he's a butcher with a Bible." The preacher lunged forward, face red, hands flailing. "You dare speak against the word? Against holy law?" Silas turned, stepped right into the preacher's path, and raised his voice to the heavens. "I dare speak for my daughter, and every daughter you've tried to silence with your sermons and smoke." The square erupted. Some people shouted, others pushed forward with questions, accusations, regrets. The tide had turned, and the fire behind them now seemed more a symbol of shame than justice. Sheriff Tully drew his weapon not to use, but to restore order. He stepped between Silas and the preacher, leveling a glare at them both. "Enough," he barked. "There'll be no more trials by fire. No more lies turned into law. This girl was wronged, and the man who wronged her just confessed." He looked at Orton. "You'll be coming with me." The blacksmith didn't resist. He hung his head, hands limp at his sides as Tully bound them in iron cuffs. Willa swayed, just a little, and Silas reached out to steady her. This time, she didn't resist his touch. The crowd, once a wall of judgment, now stood divided, some ashamed, others still in denial, but all of them changed. And in the center of it all stood the girl no one had spoken for, until now. The preacher's face had gone slack, drained of its earlier fury, its self-righteous glow replaced by something uglier: fear. Real, human fear. His hands, once raised high to summon divine fire, now trembled at his sides. He took one slow step backward, then another, as the townsfolk turned on him with growing realization. Their voices, once an echo chamber of judgment, had shifted. Now they questioned. Now they saw. "Where you goin', Reverend?" someone called. The preacher didn't answer. He turned on his heel and bolted through the crowd, pushing aside a farmer and a crying woman who had once clung to his every word. His robes tangled around his boots as he stumbled toward the church steps, breath coming in ragged gasps, but he didn't make it far. Sheriff Tully moved faster than anyone had seen him move in years. With one sharp whistle, he signaled two of his deputies, who cut across the square like hounds after a wounded fox. The preacher was halfway up the chapel stairs when one of them tackled him, the other grabbing his wrists and yanking them behind his back. The old man shrieked not with pain, but disbelief. Like the idea of being held accountable had never occurred to him. "You can't do this," he cried. "I am the Lord's vessel. You arrest me, and you arrest righteousness." Tully stepped up, face hard as granite. "You've hidden behind scripture long enough, Josiah. Tonight, you tried to kill an innocent girl. And when a man confessed to your lie, you ran. That's not righteousness. That's guilt." With deliberate calm, he turned to the other deputy still holding the blacksmith in cuffs. "Take them both. They'll sleep in a cell tonight, maybe longer." A ripple passed through the crowd: approval, relief, even a touch of shame. Not one voice rose in protest. Not one hand reached out to stop the sheriff. The same people who'd stood ready to watch a girl boil now watched justice, awkward and late, finally arrive. At the edge of the fire pit, Silas knelt beside Willa. Her legs had nearly given out beneath her, but she clung to his coat with trembling fingers. He didn't ask if she was ready. He just scooped her gently into his arms, one hand behind her shoulders, the other under her knees. She didn't resist. She simply laid her head against his chest and let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped inside her since the day she was born. He stood and turned away from the pit, from the steam that still hissed and rose like a curse unbroken, from the scorched rope that had bound her, now lying useless in the dust. The fire behind them snapped and spat, but no one dared reignite it. It had already burned the wrong thing to night their ignorance. Silas walked forward slowly, past the rows of men and women who had gathered like wolves just an hour earlier. No one met his eyes, no one dared to, and no one stepped in his way. The moon hung full and low above Hollow Creek, casting silver light across the square. It glinted off the broken locket that now hung from Willa's neck, the twin of the one pressed close to Silas's chest. Her head rested against his shoulder, but her eyes stayed open, watching the stars like they were the only witnesses that ever truly mattered. He reached the edge of the square, paused, and shifted his coat. Without a word, he draped it over her thin shoulders. It swallowed her whole, but she wrapped it tightly around herself. For the first time in years, she felt safe. Willa Rayonce, the girl no one spoke for, once called witch, whore, and worse walked away from her own execution wrapped in the arms of a father who had claimed her in front of the world. And this time, not a soul tried to stop her. The ranch sat low against the horizon, nestled beneath the widespread arms of the buttes, with morning mist rising off the paddocks like breath from a sleeping beast. It wasn't much, just a two-room cabin, a creaking barn, and a handful of stubborn horses, but to Willa Ray, it felt like a palace. A sanctuary carved from blood and dust and something deeper still, the kind of silence that didn't crush her. Weeks had passed since the night in Hollow Creek when fire had nearly swallowed her. In that time, her hands had learned the reins of a skittish mare named Echo. Her fingers, once calloused from laundry and dishwater, now knew the weight of a rifle and the rhythm of splitting wood. She learned to brace her feet in stirrups, to square her shoulders when looking a man in the eye, and to raise her voice no in defiance, but in truth. Silas taught her without saying much. He wasn't a man of many words, but he showed her how to oil a saddle, how to clean a wound with whiskey, and how to shoot straight, even with her breath caught in her chest. He didn't coddle her, but he never turned away. Every lesson was a quiet way of saying, "You matter. You are mine." Sometimes, Willa caught him standing by the cabin wall where two things now hung: her broken wrist chain and the silver locket, side by side on a rusted nail. The chain, snapped in panic the night they tried to kill her, still bore soot stains and frayed links. Silas hadn't thrown it out. Instead, he mounted it beside the symbol of their bond, a silent reminder that real freedom sometimes came through fire. People came now and then, not in groups, never loudly, but one by one they arrived. The baker's wife brought bread, her face tight with guilt. The stable boy visited on his way to market, handing Willa a carved wooden horse he'd whittled himself. Even Sheriff Tully rode out once, hat in hand, offering a box of rifle rounds and a quiet apology. Not everyone came. Some still crossed the street when they saw her. Some still whispered. Some would never change. But Hollow Creek softened at the edges. Slowly, the preacher's church now stood empty, the doors swinging in the wind. A new man from up north arrived to speak of grace instead of fire. The town square, once a place of spectacle, now held weekly meetings where folks spoke plainly, asked hard questions, and listened sometimes for the first time. Willa never went back. She had no use for wooden platforms or sanctimonious men. Her life was here now, in the dry crackle of hay underfoot and the wide-open sky above. She stood taller, laughed more, and when she passed the wall where the chain and locket hung, she would touch them with quiet reverence. Not because she needed reminding, but because she'd come to understand something that once seemed impossible. She had been worth saving, worth shouting for, worth fighting for. And if the day ever came when someone else stood where she once did, knees in the dirt, with the world turning against them, she knew what she'd do. She'd raise her voice, and the sky would split again.